Hi, this is Megan with Believe in the Red.
And this is Megan with Featherstone Nutrition.
And you're listening to Fuel for the Soul, the podcast where we chat all things nutrition and hydration and how it affects performance. But today we are beginning a very exciting series with a special guest. Megan, do you want to introduce us?
Absolutely. So we have a lot of questions that have come in over the past couple of years that are very specific to not just runners, but runners with a history of an eating disorder or disordered eating. So we decided, rather than tackle it ourselves, that we were going to bring on another expert dietitian who specializes in this area to talk with us. So welcome, Lyndsie Romas, to the show, and I will let you introduce yourself and give us a little bit about your background.
So thanks so much for having me, Megan, on the show today. My name is Lyndsie Romas. So I've been an eating disorder dietitian for nearly 10 years now. I have worked in every level of care. So for those who may not know, for eating disorder support and care, there's different levels of care. So inpatient, residential, which is 24/7 care. A step down from that would be PHP, IOP, and outpatient. So I've worked in every level of care. I've worked with children as young as 6 years old. I've worked with adolescents and adults. And really, one of the things that makes me so passionate about it is just really helping to improve these individuals' quality of life and help to eradicate and get rid of the eating disorder. So I'm just really excited to be here today to kind of shed some light on eating disorders and how whether it's an eating disorder, disordered eating, chronic dieting can impact an individual, especially those who sometimes are engaging in running or other exercise.
Eating Recovery Center, ERC, is a leading mental health care system dedicated to the treatment of eating disorders and co-occurring conditions. ERC provides expert, multidisciplinary care teams that utilize innovative and evidence-based treatment programs to offer healing and hope for a lasting recovery in individuals and their families who are suffering with an eating disorder. ERC's treatment programs are located across the nation in several states, offering in-person and virtual treatment options. They offer a full continuum of care model to meet individuals where they are at on their journey to recovery. ERC treats patients of all ages, body shapes, sizes, races, ethnicities, religions, sexual identities, gender identities, and expressions. For more information, please visit eatingrecoverycenter.com and check out the show notes for more information. So our first episode, we're going to dive into recovery from eating disorders as a runner. We have a lot of questions that relate to that. So each of the questions we're going to go over today, we'll go back to that. But we are going to start by having Lyndsie discuss with us and define just some different types of eating disorders that are out there.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. I think it's really important to share with the listeners just a little bit about some of the different types of eating disorders. As I had shared with you before, Megan, I think it can be really valuable for people to hear a little bit more about them. And if that is something they resonate with, it might help them to understand, there is help out there. So just really wanted to do a high level overview of some of the different eating disorders and diagnoses. So one that I hear about a lot is anorexia nervosa. So there's actually two subtypes. There's anorexia nervosa restricting and anorexia nervosa binge purge. So what they have in common is oftentimes an individual is losing a significant amount of weight due to nutrient restriction. So a lot of times these individuals have fear of foods they perceive as quote unquote bad, and they are going to be restricting overall nutrition intake, and it does impact their weight. And they have a fear of gaining that weight back or might have body image concerns. Something that differentiates ANR and ANBP, so the binge purge type, is that these individuals are oftentimes engaging in some sort of binging behavior and purging, but these individuals experience significant weight loss. So I'll talk a little bit about how that differentiates from bulimia here in a moment, just because I think those words can be used interchangeably sometimes by people, but just helping to kind of pull those two apart can be helpful. I wanted to talk about binge eating disorder too. So, binge eating disorder is actually the most prevalent eating disorder. It's characterized by eating a large volume of food in a short period of time. These individuals don't engage in any of those compensatory behaviors, such as self induced vomiting or purging, over exercising, what have you. Some different symptoms to look out for are eating in isolation, eating very rapidly, feeling guilty or out of control when eating. So those are some different things to think about if you're worried or concerned that you're having binge eating happening. I think something that I do mention too is that sometimes people restrict throughout the day, and then they might be eating a larger quantity of food in a shorter period of time. That's just going to need an expert to kind of suss out and evaluate, because sometimes your body is just wanting to meet the needs that your body has, and it's not necessarily binge eating disorder. As mentioned before, the next one is going to be bulimia nervosa. So these individuals are engaging in those binge behaviors as mentioned with binge eating disorders, but these individuals are engaging in those compensatory behaviors. More significantly, we see self-induced vomiting. We also can see over-exercise, laxative misuse, diuretic misuse, all working to try to prevent weight gain. The thing that's a little bit different with anorexia nervosa, binge purge, and bulimia nervosa, oftentimes those with bulimia nervosa, they do not lose a significant amount of weight. So that's one of the biggest things that kind of differentiates the two. The next one, not a lot of people have heard of the next eating disorder diagnosis, but it has more recently been put in the DSM-5 manual. So this one is ARFID, so it's avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. So this is the one that speaks more to those individuals who've been classified as quote unquote picky eaters their whole life, maybe selective eaters. So basically there's the inability to fuel their bodies sufficiently for what their body's needs are. These people do also have malnutrition to the degree of those with anorexia nervosa, or it can be even worse. So we really need to pay attention to these individuals and make sure we're giving them the support they need. We see different subtypes present for ARFID. So the one people know the most about are kind of like those texture or sensory issues. There'll be different foods that they feel like they can eat. They tend to favor sweeter foods compared to like bitter or savory foods sometimes. The next one is fear of adverse events. So sometimes I've worked with individuals who are very fearful of vomiting, fearful of cross-contamination with the food, fearful of an allergic response. And these can come from a place of like those things have never happened to them before, or they have been things that have happened to them in the past that kind of triggered the eating disorder. And then the last one is just lack of interest. So again, these are the individuals who aren't having those hunger, fullness cues. They don't have that drive to eat as others do. They tend to just get busy and forget about eating. A lot of times, individuals with ARFID don't have body image concerns, though I've definitely, in the eating disorder community, there's been conversations around both can be true. There can be that ARFID presentation, and some individuals can have fear or worry about gaining weight. So there's more research needed around that. And then the last one is other specified feeding and eating disorder. So this one is called OSFED for short. And this is what I kind of call the catch-all diagnosis. So basically, if there are significant eating concerns present, but we're not meeting the quote unquote specific criteria for another diagnosis, that individual will be given the diagnosis of OSFED likely. One of the most common diagnoses under the OSFED umbrella is atypical anorexia nervosa. So a lot of conversations in the eating disorder community about the specific language used with the diagnosis of atypical anorexia nervosa, because it kind of does make individuals feel as though their eating disorder may not be as severe, which is not true. Anecdotally, I've seen these individuals I've seen more severe medical complications in individuals with atypical anorexia nervosa over my tenure of working in the eating disorder field. So really hoping to see some changes around the verbiage there. But those are just kind of a high level overview of some of the different diagnoses.
That's super helpful. And I hope people can hear that. And maybe if they feel like they're falling into one of those categories, get some help to, begin to work through that.
Absolutely. So I just wanted to send out a trigger warning for individuals who may have struggled with an eating disorder or disordered eating. We will be talking about things such as self-induced vomiting or purging. We might talk about calories as well as weights. So just wanted to make a trigger warning available for those individuals who might struggle hearing that information.
All right. Thank you, Lyndsie. Let's get into our first question here. This is from Bree Doro. She said, "Hi there, love your podcast and impatiently wait for each subsequent episode. My question is, as someone who has struggled with an eating disorder and still is working through some of the issues, how do we know if we are eating not enough or too much without tracking? I run 40 to 50 miles a week right now and average about 15,000 steps a day and strength train roughly 3 to 4 times a week as I'm prepping for my fall marathon. I sometimes get over obsessed with tracking, but also know that I could be over or under eating, and sometimes it's hard to trust my hunger cues with my disordered past/recovery journey."
Yeah, thanks, Bree, so much for asking such a good question, as well as sharing just a little bit with us about your recovery journey. I think you bring up a lot of really good questions. So first, I want to start by addressing a little bit more about like hunger fullness. So for those who don't know, sometimes individuals going through the recovery process or who have an eating disorder oftentimes may lose some of that hunger and fullness that many individuals just kind of naturally feel. So that makes it even more difficult to be able to understand how to adequately fuel your body. So this is something that can be short term or it could be long term. I've worked with many individuals who sometimes those cues just don't come back, or they just feel like they're not able to really trust those hunger or fullness cues entirely. So that kind of makes it a little bit more complicated in understanding exactly how to fuel your body. So the question about tracking that I felt like was a really good question. I think it's a question I get a lot from my clients. They'll tell me, how do I know if I'm eating enough, if I feel like I'm eating too much? I'll share that for individuals who struggle with more of a restrictive type eating disorder, one of the things to be aware of is that it is a brain-based illness. All eating disorders are. And I think it's important to know that when is struggling with restrictive type eating disorder, there can be misfiring in the amygdala in the brain. So that is the fight, flight, fear part of the brain. So oftentimes, individuals who struggle with that, that's a natural inclination to feel as though you're eating too much, because when you see the food, you're fearful of it. So oftentimes it may skew on the side of actually not eating enough to fuel sufficiently, just due to the nature of the illness. So the question of tracking, I always ask, can this be helpful or harmful? I think it can go both ways for the individual. Sometimes, I always pull back and look at like quality of life for every individual I work with, because that's going to be different. And I think some of the wording you had used around I become obsessed with tracking, that might flag for me that maybe tracking may not be the best thing for you, but rather maybe working one-on-one with a dietitian to better understand how do you fuel not only for your baseline needs, but also the extra energy that's expended for activity. I think when working with individuals who aren't really having great hunger fullness cues, or they can't trust them, we try to also look at other signs and symptoms. So there's obviously some different physical signs and symptoms that you might see, like changes in weight, bowel habits, feeling very tired, development of something called lanugo hair on your body to help with possible like hypothermia. So different things like that. You might see changes in menstrual cycle, inability to gain muscle, hair thinning. There's a lot of different other medical complications you may see. So those can be signs and symptoms, as well as checking in with an eating disorder informed medical provider. They can run some tests to kind of determine, what does your kidney status look like? What is your liver status? How's your heart beating? Are your electrolytes normal? So really just kind of checking in from different angles to better evaluate, is the amount of nutrition you're consuming sufficient for baseline nutrition needs as well as supporting that physical activity?
Yeah, I think that is incredibly helpful. And I get this question very, very often. It's people who are like, I can't decide if tracking is still a beneficial habit for me,
Mm-hmm.
but they truly believe and feel that without tracking, they don't eat enough. So it's really helpful to hear you talk about some of the other things that they could potentially look into. And then as so many things that we talk about here on Fuel for the Soul, it's never black and white, right? It's not like
Right.
tracking is good or tracking is
Yes.
bad. It's for that specific person. Is this a conducive habit to fueling better for life and for running?
Right, absolutely. And it's funny you said the black and white element of it, because I was just having a thought too that I think tracking can feel more black and white for people, and it can be more of an answer, whereas sometimes we need to live in that gray area or that gray space. And I think like tracking can feel like I'm doing the things, I'm checking the boxes, whereas that's not always for sure or for certain going to be the best path forward.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And to mentioning finding somebody to help you one-on-one to help you gain the confidence of
Mm-hmm.
what habits are appropriate and enough for you, I think, like you said, is just valuable for a lot of people.
Absolutely.
All right. So the next question is from Kim. It says, quick question for a newish runner who is underweight and recovering from anorexia. How is pre and post run nutrition fueling different for people who have had a long history of restriction? For example, is eating 1 to 2 graham crackers enough before heading out for a 5 to 6 mile run? Should daily calorie totals be higher than quote unquote normal since weight is below where it should be?
Yeah, I appreciate that Kim's bringing up a really important question that I get a lot in the work that I do day to day. And it's, how do I fuel my body sufficiently? I think she had made mention that she is at a lower weight than she possibly should be. So I'd love to talk about that. And then in addition to that, there's also adding extra nutrition for that movement. So one of the things I always pull back and kind of consider is thinking about recovery, and the best indication for improved prognosis for recovery is full weight restoration. So as an eating disorder dietitian, I might kind of look at that and talk through with the client. I think we need to prioritize weight restoration. I do think, I found that sometimes individuals are able to, fuel sufficiently for running, for weight restoration, and the amount of movement they want to do. But then if we're finding that it's really difficult to do that, I might pull exercise out of the equation for a short period of time or reduce the amount we're doing, because we really want to make sure we fully weight restore. It allows our body to get back to where it needs to be and to function well as it helps to repair our brain from the damage that the eating disorder may have caused. So we want to make sure we're weight restoring to get to where we need to be. And then we can start working on incorporating exercise and running. I do think, depending upon where the individual is in their recovery process, can always be something we talk about and explore. And it's just, again, it's individualized to the person. So again, it's not one of those black and white answers, but I would always prioritize weight restoration. And if we aren't able to get there, just maybe manipulating our energy expenditure.
Yeah, that the whole concept that you just mentioned about weight restoration just really, I think, rings home. And I hope people struggling or feeling similar to Kim's question kind of hear that loud and clear. And I had to smile when I said, is eating 1 to 2 graham crackers pre-run enough? Because we talk a lot about like, just throw some graham crackers in your mouth and get out the door, right? But adding the complexity of her not being at the healthy weight, and as you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
not being at that healthy weight and the trajectory of where this eating disorder could go or come back, or the damage to other parts of our body and stuff that yes, we would need more, right, before a run, after a run, because it's not
Mm-hmm.
just trying to fuel that run like we talk about now, but to your point, it's also focusing on restoring that healthy weight for that individual, which is a really interesting concept to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I could probably do a whole episode on it, but I do think a lot of times it's one of the most difficult parts of eating disorder recovery is that weight restoration. And I just think we are in a society where there's a lot of weight stigma and weight bias. So it makes it hard for people to know, are they at their appropriate weight? And that's why it's really important to work with eating disorder informed providers.
And I think too, adding the complexity of the running world, and if someone lost some weight and ran a little better before they had a cascade of negative consequences, a lot of times I see people associating performance with a specific weight. But if that weight, as you're mentioning, is not a healthy weight, then we've got that additional piece of perhaps mental struggle with what is my appropriate weight and how do I get there and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, like you said, it's way more complex, but it's good to at least put some thoughts in people's head to think about things differently.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Our next question is from Anonymous. They said, it is difficult to accept that I can't turn back the clock and fix the damage that underfueling for so many years has done to my body. I'm doing a lot of work now to give myself the fuel to race again, and it's definitely a struggle mentally and physically, but Fuel for the Soul has helped. While I was listening to this podcast, I was debating whether or not I needed to take another gel, and the conversation was enough to help convince me to take it. I love that.
Right? Yeah, no, I think it's great to have that constant thought in your ear of, hey, keep fueling, make sure you're fueling more. But I do think since you have this experience of working with individuals who have struggled with exactly the same thing, like what would you tell somebody that is worried about the damage they've done to their body, whether now they're having recurrent stress fractures, even though they are restoring their weight and eating appropriately? You know, I'm sure that you've had conversations like this with folks in the past. I'm curious if you have any tips.
Yeah, absolutely. First, I just want to acknowledge for the listener just that, like, it can be a really hard process to navigate and think through the damage the eating disorder had done, and it's the coulda, woulda, shouldas. Um, can be really debilitating for some people. I'm going to switch my lens a little bit to more of a therapeutic lens because in eating disorder work, you work really closely with therapists, psych providers, medical providers. And I think something that I've really resonated with and has helped a lot of my clients who have struggled with that acceptance part is a RODBT skill called radical acceptance. And it is really, what it sounds to be. So it's really accepting the reality of the situation and trying to avoid dwelling on it because we know and understand that this is something that happened in the past. And unfortunately, we cannot change something that happened in the past, but we really need to shift our focus on the future and the present. And yes, I know it's one of those things that easier said than done, but I do think really good work with a therapist counterpart can help you navigate that. And sometimes we talk about it being a grieving process, something that we can't change. That's very hard to navigate. So navigating that and discussing that with a therapist can be really advantageous. And then I think picking up where you are and getting your feet on the ground and really just working on making sure we're fueling adequately and working side by side with a treatment team is going to be the best way to make sure you're fueling your body for where it is now and making sure we're not able to have any more damage done to our body due to the eating disorder. And I'll just also note for people who don't know a lot about eating disorders, you'll hear me talk about an eating disorder in a way that's externalizing the eating disorder from the person. It is a modality that we use when treating eating disorders because a lot of times individuals might start to feel as though the eating disorder is part of them and they can't depict what's them, what's the eating disorder. And when we separate them out, it makes it more tangible to set goals and really also hone in on the values of the individual and why they're working on recovery.
Yeah, and I'm sure that whole piece is just so valuable and therapeutic as how to continue to process through this. So yeah, I think that's great. And again, why if somebody reaches out to me with an active eating disorder, I always find other people, and we'll talk about your resources later. And we talked about the Eating Recovery Center because I do, as you mentioned, Lyndsie, it's it needs a multidisciplinary team and often needs in-person, in-depth, high-touch, interventions. So I think if anybody is listening and feels like they need some help, I can't echo what Lyndsie said enough about the interdisciplinary team of making sure that there's, medical professionals, there's therapists, there's a dietitian, and I'm sure you could probably even add more people that you've noticed need to be on that team
Yes.
as well. So I think that's a great call out. Yeah. All right. So our next question is from JP, and it says, I'm a runner and triathlete who has recently discovered your podcast. I've listened to nearly all of the episodes in the past few weeks and am feeling jazzed about fueling, right, for my upcoming races. My excitement about nutrition is tempered, however, by the anorexia diagnosis I struggled with over a decade ago. I work with a therapist and have recovered, but it always feels risky to focus too much on food. What advice do you have for those who have had an eating disorder past, but have recovered and have a serious interest in fueling now? Can you shine some light on how a sports dietitian would approach someone in my situation? Thanks in advance for considering my question.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, props to you, JP, for putting in the hard work to recover, because it's it can be such a difficult process. I do think it's valuable to continue to work with those treatment providers, because it's important in that maintenance phase, to continue to put in place preventative measures, such as what you're specifically talking about. I think for some individuals, trying to refocus on food again in a different light, in a positive way, can also, even though we're shifting it in a way in which we want to acknowledge how food is so beneficial for us and how much it can really support engaging in running and other activities that we love and enjoy, it can still be a difficult piece that pops up, and it can be triggering to previous symptoms. And you might have, we talk about like slips, laps, and relapse. It can kind of put you in a place where you're more susceptible to that. So putting together kind of that prevention plan with your therapist or working with other dietitians can be really helpful. I have worked in tandem with like sports dietitians before that have really focused on the sports nutrition element, where I had helped to kind of navigate how that has presented for them and navigating the eating disorder elements and working more from a preventative lens. So that is something that could be really helpful or advantageous, to just really explore how we can get in adequate food to fuel the sport that you want to do.
Yeah. And this is another thing that I hear fairly frequently. And I think these are very wise humans that are very aware of their past and their thoughts and their potential moving forward in lots of different directions. And having people be a little bit cautious in that, I think it makes me realize like, hey, like JP and other people in this scenario, like they really care, right? They do not want to slip back into this. So you mentioning continuing to have that plan or that touch point with the therapist is huge. And it reminded me of a former client of mine that had a history of anorexia and worked very closely with a whole team, just like we've been talking about from your end, probably more similar to what you do. And it was amazing because her therapist and dietitian were like, I think you are ready to go work with the sports dietitian now. Like, I think you're ready to take this next step and to focus on performance for fueling. And, we had a real long discussion and I said, if you want to connect me to your team at any time, that's great. But she has just done absolutely incredible from there. And it was just so refreshing to know that she had that team in the background to help with those things, but we were ready to take this next step and focus more on the performance, kind of like what JP was saying. So I think it can all work beautifully together if, other providers are very open and honest with who's ready for what.
Right. Absolutely. You bring up a few other points that I just want to make too. I think, one of the things is maybe you are in maintenance, but this could be an event that could be triggering. So I would encourage more frequent visits with your eating disorder informed providers. Just in the interim, like as you're getting started, because I think that's when we're at highest risk. It's something new, something different. And then, as Megan said, I think it's really important to have that communication, or what we call is like a warm handoff of like, I always have my clients fill out a release of information so I can best support them by working with, whatever their treatment team is going to look like. So if they're transitioning to a sports dietitian, I can talk to them a little bit about like, hey, this is what we've worked on. These are the hard parts. These are the parts they have a lot of strength in. Please feel free to reach out to me if there's any questions or concerns. So it's just really help to set them up for success in that next journey.
Yeah. You make this whole process seem so not scary, which is just so wonderful, right? Like I think there's so much stigma around disordered eating and eating disorders, and you're just like the way that you speak about it, it's just makes it seem like, yeah, it's just another thing. Like come on, let us help you. It's very refreshing to hear you talk about how you work as a team.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm really passionate about it, and I love what I do, and I just really enjoy helping people improve their quality of life, because that's really what it comes back to. And unfortunately, the eating disorders can really just grab hold of somebody's life slowly but surely. So I really just want to help people get back to like what they want their life to look like. And even sometimes, as individuals may not be in a place of readiness for that. And my hope is that they can get to that place, and then we can dive in and work on it.
Yeah.
All right. Our next question is from Rebecca. She said, "Thank you for all the advice, stories, and humor you bring to your podcast. I love running to them. I'm a recovered eating disorder, anorexia, and I'm doing really well. I started running marathons 2 years ago and have slowly been getting faster and faster. I missed the BQ by 1 minute in my last race. I don't want to quote track food as that can be triggering, so I gave up MyFitnessPal 6 months ago. Can you give some guidance on how often to eat and some ideas of carb loading meals? My body doesn't trigger hunger anymore because I ignored it for so long, so I have to eat when I should, not when I get hungry. Also, ideas of what you eat after a run would be awesome too."
So I think I can jump into some of this, and then we'll get Lyndsie to help as well. You guys know me, I'm very science-based, and there's numbers involved with like adequate nutrition for, a carb load and all that stuff. But if we are somebody that numbers are a little bit triggering for, there's plenty of ways that we can make sure that we're carb loading appropriately without counting grams of carbs, if that is triggering or not at all interesting to someone. I think we all know like how we work our best. So when we think about like, how do I eat on a normal day from a carbohydrate standpoint, most people probably need to double that for a carb load. So if you put like 1 scoop of pasta on your plate, let's put 2, right? Or if a snack has a lot of protein, let's say it's like a Greek yogurt and berries and some granola, maybe instead we do like a higher carb cereal with a banana and the yogurt, so that we're scaling up the carbs of something we normally do. So just making some of those small tweaks can allow you to still be successful with that carb load. The other thing is a lot of people will drink juice or drink kind of liquid nutrition to help with the carb load. So that's a super easy way to just add that in on top of some things that you're already comfortable eating as far as that goes. And I guess my question, for Lyndsie, which I'm never quite sure exactly how to answer, is when someone really truly doesn't have those hunger cues. Like, do you have any suggestions besides timing? That's kind of what I always say is like equate, like we always need to fuel before, we need to fuel after. This is what after should look like, which, what she was talking about, some protein, some carbs, some healthy fats, some fiber, but I'm curious if you have any better experience or better advice to give along that lack of appetite line.
Yeah, I think it's a question I get a lot as well, especially in adults who may have been suffering with an eating disorder for a long time. I think the eating disorder just creates this disconnection with like mind and body, which can make it even more challenging to fuel, like we talked about earlier. Kind of a general rule of thumb is if I'm starting with a client and they're brand new, we talk about making sure we're, in addition to what you're sharing, for like exercise and running, I think taking a baseline of like, we need to make sure we're eating every 2 to 4 hours throughout the day. And then as we kind of start with that, I work with them to work on some interoceptive awareness and being aware of their body and how it's feeling. No, we may not be feeling those hunger cues, but there might be other signs that we can look for to indicate and tell us that our body is needing fuel. So a big one that I talk about is like fatigue, brain fog sometimes dizziness, sometimes headaches. individuals feeling hangry. So like acknowledging where that emotion is coming from. So that's just like a few different ways that we talk about it with clients, and it shows up for clients individually. So that is something that I work on one-on-one with them, of like, how are you feeling? Are your emotion changing? Just really tapping into other signs that their body is showing us. Also like looking a little bit at a hunger or fullness scale is something I talk about with clients, and maybe they don't resonate with that like hunger response, but maybe they resonate with like their stomach is growling or their stomach feels empty. Different things that we can kind of work through and navigate to see if they resonate with any of those, and that can really just help us to know and learn what the body is actually needing.
And I think you bring up a really good point. We were all taught that hunger is our stomach growling, or like our stomach feeling like it needs food.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And to your point, a lot of people don't experience hunger that way, whether we have a history of disordered eating or not, you know? So it was recently I was working with someone that was having trouble eating throughout the day, like was going way too long stretches, you know, without eating. And so we were talking about, you know, how do you feel? And she's like, I never feel hungry. I never get hunger cues. So as I was working with her longer, I realized, I was like, I think anxiety might be one of her hunger cues. So we talked about that, and she was like, oh my gosh. So she started tracking that for a couple of weeks. And to be fair, noticing that and noticing that when she ate more frequently, her anxiety was much more decreased was enough to be like, okay, I got to eat more frequently. Whereas that habit had been so ingrained of going 6 to 8 hours without eating. But once she realized like my mood is better from this, it was like she was hooked to, okay, let's make this change, you know? So I think not that everyone has that cue, just like we've been saying, but I think it is really important to hone in on some of those hunger cues that are non-traditional to what we were taught.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another thing that comes up often is sometimes I work with individuals and then I ask them, how much coffee are you drinking in a day? And they're like, about 4 to 5 cups a day. And I'm like, okay, so like, let's talk about that piece of it. So I think there's a lot that kind of goes into that too. And if we can scale back slightly, again, like I don't want them to have caffeine withdrawal per se, but if we can scale back on the caffeine, sometimes that maybe allows for a reemergence of various symptoms that indicate hunger. I think sometimes that might address the fatigue in the short term for those individuals, and it's kind of covering up the more chronic fatigue. So just kind of evaluating caffeine, if it's happening, if it's not, can also be something that I would encourage people just to kind of be mindful of if they are feeling like those hunger cues aren't happening.
That's a good point. Caffeine is very much a Band-Aid for hunger cues. Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah. Good.
Okay, I think that's going to wrap up our first episode in this series. Thank you so much, Lyndsie, for coming on and answering these questions. And I also want to say thank you to all of our listeners who submitted these questions. I think a lot of these topics are maybe difficult to discuss, and Lyndsie, you made it much easier for all of us, so I appreciate you answering all of them as well.
Absolutely. Grateful to be here.